All right, so this is part 2 of Can the Nations of Latin America Overcome Their Political and Economic Problems? And we were up to the question, how did U.S. intervention impact Guatemala? Because I want to focus on some key countries, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Argentina, excuse me, not Argentina, Chile, no, Argentina, and Mexico, so we can kind of see a little bit what's going on in these countries. So now in Guatemala, Guatemala was the first place where there were more radical solutions that began to be tried in the country. It has a very large Native American population. The population was mostly illiterate. They had very poor health conditions, very high infant mortality rates. The land was distributed completely unequally, and the economy was pretty much dependent on coffee and banana prices, which were very volatile. So it was considered one of these banana republics, which I talked about in the previous video, and it was an economy that was dependent on one crop sold primarily to one superpower, and they faced military and political intervention from that superpower if there was issues with the ability to make money in that country. The largest landowner in Guatemala was a company called United Fruit. It was the largest landowner. It was an American company. They had a monopoly on transportation and infrastructure, and they purposely would suppress banana production in their goal to keep the prices as high as possible. So as a result, thousands of acres of arable land was left fallow, was left unplanted, because United Fruit owned all of it, and United Fruit didn't want to overproduce bananas because they wanted to make sure that the price of bananas stayed very low and made as much money for them as possible. So in 1944, this man here, Arevalo, was elected president in 1944. He believed in something he referred to as spiritual socialism, in which he wanted to reform the land ownership. He wanted to improve the rights and conditions of rural and industrial workers. And he wanted to institute things like an income tax, and he wanted to do educational reforms. And he encouraged a very intense nationalism amongst the Guatemalan people. The issue that Arevalo began to experience was that he came into conflict with United Fruit. So basically, Arevalo eventually serves his time in office. His power is passed to this man here, Arbeñez, in 1951. So Arevalo came to power in 1944. Arbeñez comes to power in 1951. He was elected president. His nationalism was even more radical than Arevalo, and he had extreme opposition to all of the foreign influence in Guatemala. He began to institute programs to nationalize transportation, to nationalize the electricity grid, and other parts of the economy. And basically in 1953, he decided to seize the unused land of large estates. And like I said, remember, United Fruit was the largest landowner in the country, had largest amounts of land unplanted. So Arbeñez decided to try to seize that land. 400,000 acres of land was seized. Those companies were offered compensation, but the land was going to be redistributed to the landless poor. This provoked a large amount of opposition from those who did own land, in particular United Fruit. Also, remember, United Fruit had a monopoly over transportation and infrastructure in Guatemala, so he built a highway from the capital to the Atlantic Ocean to break United Fruit's monopoly on transportation. Now, this is a classic example of what happens when the U.S. thinks a country might be heading down the path of communism, because he was nationalizing the land and nationalizing certain industries. The U.S. began to fear a communist takeover. In addition, they were under a great deal of pressure from United Fruit, and so the U.S. denounces the changes. They imposed economic and diplomatic restrictions on Guatemala, and the government began receiving support from the political left, so more of the communists. So as a result, in 1954, with help from the CIA, a dissident military force that was against Arbeñez's rule invades Guatemala in 1954. Arbeñez is overthrown, and a man is put in his place who is pro-American. His name is Carlos Castillo Armas. So he comes to power as a result of this CIA military takeover. He is pro-American. He got rid of the land reform plans. He developed a settlement that was favorable to United Fruit. He abolished political parties. He disenfranchised people who were illiterate. So about half the population was illiterate in Guatemala. They lost all voting rights. Opposition was jailed, tortured, exiled, in some instances executed. As a result, Guatemala continued to have a very low standard of living. Their economic and social problems were never addressed. Armas is assassinated in mid-1957, and this led to a civil war that only ended in the 1990s, in which 100,000 people died. By the mid-1980s, the military began to return the government to civilians, and also the fear of communism spreading was beginning to fade. But we see here, also by the end of the Cold War, the U.S. becomes less willing to support these repressive regimes just because they're not communist. But in the end, you see that we had leaders in Guatemala that wanted to attempt to make changes and wanted to attempt to improve the lives of their people. And because of the Cold War and the fear that this was going to turn them into a communist state, those changes were reversed. And also because it was a banana republic and, you know, foreign companies had so much power in the country, they were able to kind of dictate what type of government that they would have. So the next country we're going to look at is, how did the Cold War impact events in Nicaragua? Now, of course, you all know Nicaragua is a country that's very near and dear to my heart. But in 1909, the U.S. had supported an overthrow of the government in Nicaragua, and basically encouraged revolts. We even sent Marines in to kind of encourage this revolt. U.S. troops stayed in Nicaragua until 1933. And our troops trained with the Nicaraguan National Guard, in particular to defend U.S. interests in Nicaragua. Now, a man by the name of Augusto Sandino was an army officer who had rejected the U.S. power in Nicaragua. So between 1927 and 1933, he fought a guerrilla war against the Marines and the Nicaraguan National Guard. He was eventually murdered by officers. And a man by the name of Garcia seizes control of the country with the support of the U.S. And his presidency basically became a family dynasty. In the 1960s, a revolutionary movement began to form that was kind of in Sandino's honor, and they became known as the Sandinistas. And so the party that was formed was the Sandinista Front for National Liberation. And they started a guerrilla revolt against the Garcia family's dynasty of ruling Nicaragua. So the government is driven into exile, and in 1979, the Sandinistas had came to power. By that point, about 50,000 people had been killed. And the Cuban government had been assisting the Sandinistas because the Sandinistas did have some left-wing leanings. So President Reagan decided to take on a policy to destabilize the Sandinista government. They authorized the creation of a paramilitary force against them in Honduras that were known as the Contras. And they were trained and supplied by the U.S. So that Honduras is on the northern border of Nicaragua. So they used that as a way then to kind of invade Nicaragua from the north in trying to overthrow the Sandinistas. They also mined Nicaraguan harbors, which got the condemnation of the World Court. The U.S. Congress basically refused to fund this war because we were originally funding the Contras. And then it was funded secretly by profits from arms sales to Iran. It was something called the Iran-Contra affair. Basically, we just start to see a negotiation of peace settlements. And since 1990, Nicaragua has been ruled democratically elected government. I say democratically elected government. I'm not really so sure because there's not that many political parties. There's a lot of... It's still a destabilized country. There's still a lot of corruption within the government. Obviously, this country is not functioning very well. It's the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. But the Sandinistas are still a major ruling power. So you can see this is the Sandinista flag, the FSLN. Like I said, there is voting. People do get to go and vote, and they do vote in large numbers. But I don't know if I would completely call the country very democratic. But it does have a democratically supposedly elected government and better relations with the U.S. since the 1990s. So the next question looks at Chile. So what challenges did Chile face in trying to create a democracy? So I think I mentioned something about this one in class, about how the military and the civilian government in a lot of ways would function separate of each other. And if the military, in certain instances in some of the developing world, if they didn't like the government, they would overthrow the civilian government. And that's an example here in Chile. So Chile's main source of money is the copper mines. A lot of the copper mines in Chile are owned by U.S. companies. So they did have a moderate government and relatively good relations with the U.S. In the 1960s, though, 70s, in the 1970s, people began seeking more radical reform, and a man by the name of Allende, I'll write that for you, was elected president. And Allende was a socialist, and the U.S. government opposed him coming to power immediately. Some of the things that Allende did is he increased agrarian reform, kind of again to try to redistribute the land because it was so unequally distributed. He purchased the control of banks. He nationalized the foreign-owned copper industry, which upset people like countries like the U.S. since they owned a lot of the copper mines. About 75% of Chile's exports are copper. He increased the salaries of government workers, expanded military and housing programs. But the problem is, in his attempt to do these things, like increasing salaries, and expanding medical services, and expanding housing programs, we see a lot of inflation in trying to pay for these programs, and they didn't have enough money. The U.S. government, because they opposed Allende's rule, reduced loans that were given to Chile, and the International Bank also cut back on loans given to Chile. And the CIA mandated an overthrow of Allende, began financing opposition parties. The middle class in particular did not like Allende. They did not like the fact that he was redistributing the land, and they persuaded the military to act. So on September of 1973, the military attacked and bombed the presidential palace. You can see what's going on in this picture up here. And President Allende was killed. This guy here, what is Allende's name? But this guy here, his name is Pinochet. He was the general. So Pinochet is going to come to power, and he's going to head a new government. He immediately jailed 100,000 of Allende supporters. He killed several thousand of them. He basically was very violent to the opposition. He did restore the economy because he did start getting aid to the U.S., but he was pretty much a brutal dictator. And in 1988, a plebiscite rejected Pinochet's rule, and the government passed to become a democracy. And Pinochet fled the country, and then in the 1990s, there was an attempt to, I think he was in Spain, there was an attempt to bring him back to Chile so he actually could face trial for all the crimes that he committed against the people of Chile during his kind of brutal reign in Chile. So the next country we're going to look at is Argentina. So Argentina is a country that's known for its beef industry. That's like their major moneymaker. They had a middle class. The middle class radical party had power in the 1920s, but they fell when the economy collapsed in 29. There was a lot of failed military coups in the years during the Great Depression, and Argentina in general was very dependent on foreign investments. Britain was almost like their quasi-mother country because they had such close economic ties to Britain. But in the 1930s, obviously because of the Great Depression, their foreign investments declined. Their market for foreign sales declined. Industry was growing in Argentina, though, and the workers were demanding more and more power. And basically, we see like major union movements and workers' movements develop within Argentina. And so basically what we have, though, in the government are conservatives backing traditional military powers. So through the 30s, through the 40s, we have a lot of military rule. And the new military rulers were very nationalist. They wanted to industrialize and modernize. and they wanted to make Argentina the dominant power in Latin America. But some of these were fascist, and many of the rulers, the government, were very distrustful of the workers. This man here, Juan Perón, he also, if you look at this picture, comes from a military background, but he decided he needed to create a broader base of support, and he wanted to gain the support of the workers. So he had a position in the Ministry of Labor, and through that position in the Ministry of Labor, he was able to appeal to the workers. He promised them things like raising their salaries and improving their benefits and supporting what they wanted, and he gained very popular support, aided by his wife, Eva Perón, who was like this icon. She also was someone who came from a lower class. She came from, out in the countryside. She became like a radio actress and then kind of rose to fame, and then meets Perón and eventually marries him. So she was very, very popular and very, very instrumental in him gaining power, and why he had such great widespread support. So Perón becomes president. He made an alliance with the workers, with the industrialists, with the military. He used the radio, he used press, he used public speeches really to mobilize his support. And he was very charismatic, and he was also very oppressive, though, of his opponents, and he did that in order to maintain power. So this Peronist program was defined very much in nationalistic terms as well. He nationalized the foreign-owned railroads, the telephone companies, the petroleum resources, and the foreign debt. They were able to pay off their foreign debt, and their economy was doing very well. But then problems began to develop for Perón. First off, in 1949, we start to see major economic problems begin again. And then in 1952, Eva, his wife, died of cancer. This created a huge outpouring of grief. She was very young. She was like 33, 34 years old. But she was a major reason why he had the support of the lower classes, and the workers in particular. The workers were known as the descamisados, which means the shirtless ones. Those are the names for the workers. This was a huge outpouring of grief upon her death. Here you could see, these are the people that were showing, oh no, that's not that, that's the wrong picture. But millions of people showed up for her funeral. It was a huge outpouring of grief, but it kind of really hurt him as far as being able to maintain power. And so basically, the economy was doing bad, Eva dies, the industrialists were not happy with the power of the labor unions, an opposition group forms. He was taking away civil liberties to kind of put down all of this opposition. The military was very worried that Perón would arm the workers and cut back on the power of the military. And the Peronist power became more radical, and he was driven out of power in 1955. The Peronist party was banned. And then we see a succession of civilian governments backed by the military that tried to rule. The economy was still very bad, the government was still very unstable, and basically union workers began to agitate for Perón's programs again. In 1973, he actually comes back to Argentina with his new wife, Isabel. He is president, she's vice president, but he dies a year later. Now, from 1976 until 1983, there are severe political measures taken against anybody who opposes the government. There were measures taken like torture, execution of opponents, and what becomes known as the Dirty War. The government went after left-wing activists, trade unionists, students, Marxists, Peronists, and any suspected sympathizers of Perón. The estimate is that about between 9,000 and 30,000 people disappeared without a trace. They were known as the Los where did I lost it? Los desaparecidos, the disappeared ones. So like I said, between 9 and 30,000 people basically gone, no one ever knowing what happened to them. The government also engaged in the Falkland Island War in 1982. Falkland Islands were islands off the coast of Argentina that were controlled by the British, and they did that to try to gain popular support for the government in 1982. That was a huge failure. they lost the war. The military regime falls in 1982, and the country finally becomes a democracy after that. This is the walls of all the people who disappeared in the Dirty War. So the last area we're going to talk about is Mexico, and what are the major conditions facing Mexico today. Now, the first thing to know about Mexico is that in the early 1900s, there is a huge revolution in Mexico. It starts out because a man by the name of why is this writing like this? Porfirio Diaz was president of Mexico. He rules Mexico from 1876 to 1910. He had a very centralized government supported by the army, supported very much by foreign capitalists, the landowners, the Catholic Church. 20% of the land in Mexico at this time was owned by Americans. During this time period, about 95% of the people owned no land, and about 1,000 families in Mexico owned all of the land. So he came to power on the policy. He comes to power after, oh my Lord, what's his name? Well, he comes to power on the policy of that he's only going to run for one term and then not be reelected, and then he winds up ruling from 1876 to 1910. So obviously he was reelected, and he's do lots of rigging with the voting. So he is challenged, and he is basically forced from power. A new constitution is written in 1917, which creates a very strong presidency, but institutes land reform policies, limits foreign investors. Natural resources in Mexico were nationalized. The power of the church was restricted as far as their power over education and the ownership of property. And the National Confederation of Workers were given representation in the government. So from 1940s until 2000, Mexico was controlled by what was called the PRI. And that was the Party of the Institutionalized Revolution. So their job was to try to keep the power of the revolution alive. And so by the late 20th century, though, there was a great deal of corruption, and there wasn't really much social improvement going on in Mexico. And many believed that there was very little revolutionary principle that remained in the PRI. So in 1994, a guerrilla movement erupted in the Indian southern state of Chiapas, and they were calling themselves Zapatistas. Zapata was a famous leader in the fight during the Mexican Revolution, and basically this showed how basically the major social issues that were supposed to be addressed in the revolution really were never resolved, and the government responded with repression and some sorts of negotiation. Now, also what we have in 1990s, the U.S. joins what's known, and here you can see all the issues that are going on with the PRI and the economy dropping off, and there being all this corruption and drug violence. But in the 1990s, Mexico joined something called NAFTA. NAFTA stands for the North Atlantic Free Trade Association. And the hope was that this would spur on Mexican industry. And so the U.S. is their second largest trading partner. And they're still kind of not quite clear what happened. There was a lot of fear that a lot of U.S. jobs would move down south of the border to Mexico. That actually does not happen, partly because the Mexican government is kind of shaky, especially with all of the drug violence that happens in Mexico. What we do see, though, is factories develop along the borders. They're called So these are the factories that are made on the borders, but they pay the workers very little money, and they were prevented from organizing any sort of unions. So in 2000, the PRI lost control over the country, and we see that the leader at that point was Vicente Fox, and his goal was to try to improve the conditions in Mexico but there's still many Mexicans come here looking for jobs because the conditions in Mexico are so bad. The drug violence has gotten worse and worse over the years. So I don't really know if I would say that Mexico has created a stable government itself. So the last summary question is, can these problems be solved? What are some of the major things that need to be done in order to solve these problems in South America as a whole?